Hello, welcome back to AP World History, where today we're going to learn about an era of world history called New Imperialism. This was a period that took place during the late 19th century, that is, the late 1800s, and this was a period where European countries spread their influence throughout the world, much like they did in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. However, as we shall see today, this looked quite differently from back then. Okay, so what is our objective today? Our objective is to analyze changes in the process of imperialism from the 1500s to the 1900s. So how did it change from that era of colonization to the era of 1900s? So some important terms that we should be able to define by the end of this lesson are imperialism, nationalism, jingoism, ethnocentrism, the white man's burden, social Darwinism, colony, protectorate, and sphere of influence. If you're taking notes during this lecture, you should be able to define all of these words by the end of the lesson. Okay, so really quickly, what is imperialism? Imperialism is the basic policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Okay, so this can look very different across different colonies, but the basic premise is that we can analyze this in three different ways. Both how did they dominate countries economically, so through their money systems and their trading, how they dominated politically, that is, exerting direct political control over other countries, forcing them to do what the mother country wants them to do, or their social domination, where we can reshape your social systems to make it benefit us. Okay? So the way that we analyze history, if you are not familiar, is there's a couple ways that we can compartmentalize our frame of reference through history, and we call this ESP. No, it's not psychic brain powers. It's what we call economic, social, and political. Economic has to do with money and trade. Social are social movements, religion, social and racial classes, anything like that can be analyzed through the social system. Then one last system by which we can analyze things is political. Who is in charge of the country? This has to deal with governments and public policy. So colonialism versus imperialism. As we talked, this is basically almost the same as when we saw countries that people are probably more familiar with, like the American colonies, French colonies, and so it's very similar, but there is one important difference. Colonialism is much more of the practice, that is the extension of direct control over another colony, whereas what changed here is imperialism is the reason why. Okay, so you can have both of these systems in place. They're not mutually exclusive. Colonialism is the practice, and the imperialism is the reason why we implement colonialism. As we shall see later in this lesson, colonialism is not the only way by which countries exerted influence over other countries. And for you, here's a funny meme. Here's a fact: non-Western countries cannot be imperialist. As we shall see throughout a lot of the history, imperialism is actually very, very common throughout history. We have Saudi Arabia, the Mughal Empire, Imperial Japan, Persian Empire, Chinese Empire, and probably the biggest of them all was the Mongol Empire. They all practice forms of imperialism. Okay? So what are some causes of imperialism? We're going to think of this in the ESP system. There's one that's economic. Industrialization was a major cause of imperialism. Another is social causes. The white man's burden, social Darwinism, and religious missionaries. Finally, we have our third cause of imperialism, political. This is nationalism. We're going to start by looking at the political first, nationalism. So what is nationalism? This is a word you should be able to define by the end of this lesson. Nationalism are nation states that maintain a single national identity based upon culture, ethnicity, geographic location, language, and politics. Okay, so if we had to say this very succinctly, German people who speak German, who have a German heritage, they should control themselves and they should have their own nation state, that is, their own country. Whereas French people with French language and French politics and French ethnicity, they should have their own country. These nation states, importantly, should be separate and independent of one another. This type of nationalism grew out of the Latin American revolutions, where people like Bolivar were high on nationalism and actually wanted to create their own Latin nation state within Latin America. This also grew out of the French Revolution. After Napoleon Bonaparte conquered almost the entirety of Europe, everybody wanted to get out from under the thumb of another country. So nationalism grew after the Napoleonic Wars. One effect of nationalism is that it increased competition for power among European states. Every country is now incredibly patriotic, and because every country wants to be the best, they are vying for power amongst each other to become the best. Patriotism fueled a desire for an empire. In order to be the best, you need the most resources, you need the most land, and you need to be the most powerful. So an empire fueled this desire. Nations then competed to create colonies all around the world, similar to how they did in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. They also competed to build up their military power because of nationalism, because you need to protect your colonies from other imperial countries. This led to another word that you should be able to define, jingoism. This idea of extreme, intense, burning patriotism, especially in the form of aggressive or warlike foreign policy. This means that these hyper-patriotic countries were very aggressive and wanted to go to war either with each other or with other countries in order to assert national dominance. So when we think about history, we can also think about this in our own normative ideas. That is, can we think about it as, are nationalism and imperialism inherently contradictory notions? This is just something to spark your innovation and your mind. So you could think about it as nationalism for me and not for thee. So as we go around conquering other countries, those countries aren't allowed to be nationalistic, but we're going to be nationalistic. Us Great Britons are going to conquer other people in order to improve our national status. However, places and colonies such as Egypt, they don't get to be nationalistic because we are busy controlling them. So nationalism for me and not for thee. I think that this is inherently a contradictory position. Another reason why imperialism was big during this time was it was an effect of the Industrial Revolution. So now we've moved away from the political causes of imperialism, and now we're moving towards the economic causes. So industrialization. You can think about this as two different ways. Industrialization caused both supply reasons for imperialism and demand reasons. On the supply side, industrialization increased the need for resources in other countries. So for example, if Great Britain needed wood from other countries in order to build a chair, they needed to get that wood from another country. So they would go and conquer other countries that had the resources that they could not produce. similar things such as if you need wool in order to make shirts, you had to go and find a country that could produce that wool or that cotton in order to make your shirts for you. But we can also think about this on the demand side of industrialization and causes of imperialism, where you have a new desire for markets to sell manufactured products. If we're busy making a lot of shirts because now we have cotton that's grown from other countries and taken from them, what's the point of having all these shirts if we can't sell them to somebody? They're just going to sit in a warehouse somewhere doing absolutely nothing. So we need to create new markets to sell our manufactured products. So after we've taken cotton from places like Egypt, we are now going to sell our new shirts right back to them in order to make money. That is two reasons why industrialization increased the desire for imperialism. We need resources from other countries, and then once we have those resources and turn them into manufactured products like shirts, we can then sell it back to those countries to make profit. Another reason, and this kind of ties both into economic and political reasons, why imperial countries were looking for other countries is because they needed military bases. Military bases were needed around the world to resupply naval vessels. So, for example, in America, you have America and Hawaii that served as a refueling depot to get to the Philippines over here. You also had Britain and South Africa. This was a major part of South Africa, where if you've got Great Britain, who needs to go all the way across to the Indian country, there's no way you're going to get all the way around there without stopping. It's just not doable. So, Great Britain established colonies here, 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 and here in South Africa, so that way they have stops along the way whereby they can either get new materials to take to India, or they can stop and refuel on their way to India. Okay? Another reason why they created military bases is they needed to control important waterways. So, for example, Great Britain needs to get to the Indian Empire. However, going all the way around South Africa, while doable, is incredibly expensive and it is incredibly hard and long to do. However, if we could make this shorter, we could theoretically cut through this landmass here and then come out on the other side and go to India. However, there's a big landmass here. As you'll learn in the next lesson, Egypt built what's called the Suez Canal here, where you could cut the time down to 2 weeks to get from Great Britain to the Indian Empire. So if Great Britain could control Egypt, they could have control over this waterway and thus could get to the Indian Empire much quicker and more efficiently than any other country could do. This was also important, as we see in the Panama Canal down here, cutting the time to go to the other side of South America in half, or even longer than half. So we have these important waterways that make some countries more powerful than others if you have access to those waterways. So, we've looked at political and economic factors for imperialist countries. Now, let's take a look at some social factors. So, some social factors that happened were this idea of ethnocentrism, and this is a word that you should be able to define at the end of this lesson. Ethnocentrism is the opinion that one's own way of life is natural or correct. This can include different factors such as your religion. Ethnocentrism, they predominantly practiced Christianity, and so they believed that Christianity is natural and correct. They also had politics such as democracy. they believe that their democratic system of government was more correct than others are. Their form of technology is more correct and natural than other countries. Their languages were better. Their styles of dress were better. So all of these factors are included in this idea of ethnocentrism. The idea that all of these things in Europe are better than other countries. Ethnocentrism is predominantly used during this time in Europe, but it can be really applied to any culture that you feel is superior to another culture. This ethnocentrism led to the idea of the white man's burden. The white man's burden is another word that you should be able to identify, and this is the belief that Westerners had a duty to civilize heathens. That is, if we think that our way of life is more correct than others, then obviously we have a duty to bring them up to our level and civilize them. Okay? This is based off of a poem by Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, where he takes up the idea that Americans should have imperialist aims because of this white man's burden idea. That we need to civilize these other countries in order to bring them up to par, because that's only what a good person would do. If you cared about other people, then why would you not imbue with them your Christian values and your democratic values and your language and your styles of dress? If it's obviously better, why would you not do that? So that's the idea of ethnocentrism and the white man's burden. Another factor that was included in this is the idea of social Darwinism, another word that you should be able to identify and define. Social Darwinism are Darwin's principles of natural selection that are now being applied to human societies as well. In case you're unfamiliar, the idea of Darwinism and natural selection is very, very simple. It's the idea that almost that the fittest survive. While it is much more complicated than that, we're not going to get too far into that. But for really, all you need to know is this idea that animals adapt to their environment over time, and that the best fitted for their environment are able to reproduce and survive. So for example, if you live in a system or an environment that is very leaf heavy, then you're going to want this kind of beak in order to eat those leaves. Whereas if you have a beak that is not good with leaves, such as the buds in fruit beak, then the beak that's specialized for buds in fruit are going to die off. So the idea of social Darwinism is it takes this idea and applies it to human societies as well. Therefore, thinking that the most dominant and the most powerful countries are therefore the best countries, and that they're more fit to survive and thus should and have the moral high ground in order to capitalize and dominate other countries. They feel that they are morally justified in dominating other countries because clearly they are the most fit to survive in this world. So another social factor that comes up is the religious missionaries. And one religious missionary that was very important was Dr. David Livingstone. As you can see on this map here, this is a map of his travels in South Africa in 1852 and 1856. This is what's called the opening up of Africa, where Africa was largely a mysterious place that people did not go to, or Europeans largely did not go to. But religious missionaries went in with the idea of preaching the gospel of Christianity to convert other native peoples to Christianity. Once they reported back on their African travels and their religious conversions, other European countries got wind of this and said, hey, we can do this too. We can now go into these countries because now we know all about it and we know how to best do it. And we know that they're open and receptive to our Christian ideals. This is very much interconnected with the idea of ethnocentrism that we talked about earlier. The idea that obviously Christianity is the best religion because it's correct and God inspired, and therefore it would be horrible for us to not preach the gospel to other people in order to save them. Another reason why this social factor was a big player in increasing power was if you can control religion of a particular people, then you can increase your power and influence over those countries. If you have a country that is Christian where you're also Christian, you might have less rebellions, you might have more cooperation with that country and more cooperation with the people. You're also going to be able to get them to do just about anything you want because you can make any appeal to Christianity. If they believe that what they're doing is God inspired, then they're going to do it for you. So if you could have a country convert to Christianity, or a large portion of the population, then you can increase power and influence over those colonies. Now the question is, instead of looking at why did countries have imperialist aims in the first place, now we're going to look at why were they so effective. So as you can see in this map that we looked at earlier, you have Great Britain who owns almost all of this land here. The old adage is that the sun never set on the British Empire, and this is very true. They owned from this side of the globe all the way across to this side of the globe. So how were they able to do this when Great Britain is just this tiny country here? How were they able to do that? Well, there's several factors. One was communication. So improvements in technology through the Industrial Revolution improved their communication. So the telephone or the telegraph. Now, how does communication improve their control over countries? Well, it improves response time in crises in these far-flung countries. So if a rebellion pops up in one country, such as the Boxer Rebellion in China, then the country can quickly communicate and respond effectively in a timely manner, because it no longer are we handing off letters through horse and buggy or through on foot. We are now having to do almost instantaneous communication, and now that we've got this instantaneous communication, we can send out our warships and our troops in order to quash those rebellions. This also applies to quashing attempts at other European countries to intrude upon your colony. If Great Britain has interests in India, then if Germany or France or Spain tried to take over and control the Indian Empire, then this instantaneous communication means that Great Britain can respond much quicker in those times of crises. Another reason why they were so effective was because they obviously had far superior weapons. Imagine fighting against spears, shields, and swords with your guns. You're going to win that battle every single time. You also have steam warships and cannons that greatly improve your chance of winning against these very archaic and rudimentary countries that were still fighting with very old technology. Another reason, now that we've talked a little bit about why they were so effective, now we can talk about a little bit about how imperial influences looked at this time. And these are three words that you should be able to define by the end of this lesson. A colony. This is an imperial power where they have direct control over the country. They control everything that goes on in that country. So an example of this is back in the 17th century with the American colonies. Okay, Great Britain had direct control over the colonies, and they said everything that happened. all the laws that were passed in the British Parliament applied to the colonies as well. However, there's different kinds of influence. Another one that was very popular among this time was the protectorate. And this is the idea that the territory is under the quote-unquote protection of imperial power. So if a country starts getting attacked by another country, let's say Britain's colonies are being attacked by Germany, then Britain will protect that colony. In exchange for that protection, the colony is going to do what Britain asks of them, whether it be trading partners or anything else. So an example of this is the British Malay system, where you have all of these British Isles down here, and these are all protectorates. So you can also see French Indochina over here, where if the French ever attacked the British Malay countries, then Britain would come to their direct aid. However, the British Malay were able to largely govern themselves. It was only whenever they were attacked that Britain would really directly interfere with them. The last form of imperial influence is this idea of the sphere of influence. This is where imperial powers have exclusive trading or political rights within a particular country. As you'll see in the next lesson, you can see this very directly in Persia or modern-day Iran, where Russia and Great Britain both had spheres of influence and trading relationships with the country. We can also see this in American colonies or in the Americas, where the Monroe Doctrine essentially created a sphere of influence that the U.S. had over South America, where other countries were not allowed to have interests in South America, or else the U.S. would retaliate. So the U.S. had a sphere of influence over South America, and they took very large control over this by having trading partnerships with South America, or even just direct control over them, sometimes politically speaking. But they had a sphere of influence where they had exclusive or political rights within that country. So finally, let's wrap up what we talked about. Some words that you should define, and I left off the last three on accident, are imperialism, nationalism, jingoism, ethnocentrism, the white man's burden, social Darwinism, and finally the last three that I forgot on here: a colony, a protectorate, and a sphere of influence. You should be able to define all of these words by the end of this lesson. Be sure that you have these definitions written down in your notes. And that's all. I'll see you for the next lesson.